This is the Comics Alternative Interviews, talking with Denis Kitchen for Will Eisner Week 2018. Greetings and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews. I'm Derek, and on this episode I talk with Denis Kitchen for Will Eisner Week 2018. But before I get to that conversation, I want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are anywhere from 20 to 35% off of the cover price, and every single month you're going to find some incredible specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off of the cover price, sometimes 50% off cover, but occasionally you can find discounts that are even more impressive than that. And if you check out dcbservice.com right now, you'll find a variety of books by and about Will Eisner at wonderful discounts. For instance, you can get the 10th anniversary edition of Fagin the Jew at 40% off the cover price, Will Eisner's The Spirit, a celebration of 75 years at 40% off. There are also a variety of DC's Spirit archive volumes that are still in print that are at great discounts. And Will Eisner, The Centennial Celebration, 1917 through 2017 from Dark Horse and Kitchen Sink Books at a whopping 40% off of the cover price. There's no better way to educate yourself on the life and works of Will Eisner than by checking out the great deals at Discount Comic Book Service. Remember, go to dcbservice.com for all of your comics pre-ordering needs, and after you do get your titles there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you. For the past several years, we've been doing special episodes of the Comics Alternative celebrating Will Eisner Week, which takes place every year the first week of March, around Will Eisner's birthday. It's an annual opportunity not only to honor the contributions of this American artist, but to promote comics, graphic novel literacy, and free speech in a variety of public and educational settings. On our very first Will Eisner Week episode, we had Denis Kitchen on the show. Not only is he a comics legend in his own right, but in the 1970s he became the publisher and the close friend of Will Eisner. Denis was on the podcast last summer to discuss the recently published Will Eisner, The Centennial Celebration, a collaboration between Dark Horse and Kitchen Sink Books. But I invited him back this year to discuss in more detail his relationship with Eisner, the history between them as friends and businessmen, and his first-hand accounts of Will Eisner's development as a graphic novelist, beginning in the late 1970s with his publication of A Contract with God. This was definitely an insightful conversation that I had with Denis, and I want to share that with you right now. I'm very excited to have back on the Comics Alternative Denis Kitchen, and what better person to talk with for Will Eisner Week. Denis, how you doing?
Hey, doing good, Derek.
Last time we talked was over the summer. You, Andy, and I had a conversation about some of the Kitchen Sink Press stuff that had been coming out over the past year.
That's right. That's when there were two guys with PhDs. Now there's only one.
Yeah, well, I have a number of other co-hosts, some of which have PhDs.
Okay.
But this time around talking with you, it's just mano a mano.
Got it.
Now, maybe a great place to start, since this is Will Eisner Week, is For those who may not have listened to any of our previous conversations with you, and heaven forbid, may not know who Denis Kitchen is and his links to Will Eisner, why don't you introduce yourself within the context of Will Eisner, your friendship with him, your work, and all of that?
Sure. Well, I started out as a cartoonist in the underground comics movement, the late 60s and early 70s. And I became a publisher when I founded Kitchen Sink Press, and to my astonishment, it kept growing and lasted for 30 years. Very early into that, in 1971, I was at my first comic convention in New York City, a Phil Seuling convention, and to my astonishment, Will Eisner sought me out through an intermediary, which I didn't even believe at first until I actually was brought into his suite, and he was very curious about underground comics and the economics and the rights issues, everything you can imagine. He started quizzing me, and I found it very surreal that a newcomer like me, a relative unknown at that point, was being brought to see a living legend. And at that time, we couldn't have looked more different. I've, in fact, caricatured it in an exaggerated way. I was an archetypal hippie, and Will was in a three-piece suit. And as he put it a number of times in later years, we both smoked pipes, but with different substances. And from that unlikely initial meeting, I did become his publisher, first on a small scale, then on a major scale, and we became friends, and I still represent the estate, and so it's been a long, long relationship.
So it was, as you put it, I guess, the economics and the artist rights aspect of the Undergrounds that really drew him, because I guess the content was one of these, he was diametrically in the opposite direction of what many of you guys were doing in the 60s and into the 70s. It
would seem that way on the surface, but he really was a kindred spirit on key issues. You have to remember, when Will was there at the birth of the comic book, and the rules in those days were basically the publisher owned everything. We all know the horror stories about Superman and the publishers Donenfeld and Leibowitz, and we know what happened to Harvey Kurtzman with Mad, and on and on. And Will got out of that business in the early 50s. It didn't really appeal to him, but comics were always his love. He saw enormous potential in them. He just didn't like the business model. And Will, unlike most cartoonists, most artists in general, Will also had a knack for business. And so he was a successful businessman doing educational comics for the government and private industry and so forth. So by the time I met him in 1971, he was successfully doing a monthly magazine called PS for the U.S. Army and doing things for private clients. And so when he saw what was happening with the Undergrounds, it sparked something in him, which was he had always hoped that there would be an opportunity for artists to work in an environment where the artists were in control and not the publisher. And as he slowly learned about it and realized these long-haired guys were doing something interesting, he decided to kind of dip his toe in that water. And before too long, he had retired from his other businesses, and he was back being a full-time artist again.
Now, you were instrumental, at least for many readers, in helping to bring the Spirit to the attention of people who may not have known about it before. I know that there was a dalliance with the Spirit, the comic, with Harvey back in the 1960s, and then in the early 70s, I think after you met Will Eisner, with Warren Publications. But I think you really helped to put, with Kitchen Sink Press, the Spirit back on the map for many readers, at least readers my age.
Well, I guess so. Specifically, it was 1966. He did 2 issues for Harvey, and there was a third in production that was never published. So it didn't do well enough to really be revived in 66. And it wasn't really Warren next. Technically, the next two I did in 1971, I believe. We called the Underground Spirit only because I did them, and Will did probably stuff a little sexier than he ever did before because he could. And those two undergrounds were kind of a test because Will was not really convinced that the audience I reached, which was a young audience, would care about this, a character with a mask and a blue suit that he thought was way out of date. But he was surprised, and we were both pleased to see that they sold very well. At that point, Jim Warren had been watching, and Jim was always a big fan of Will's, and he came to Will and very matter-of-factly said, look, very interesting what this kid in Wisconsin is doing, but he said, I can put you on newsstands, and I can get your sales from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands. And so Will called me, and he said, look, I really appreciate what we did. I'm sure we'll work together in the future, but I think you understand why I can't turn down this opportunity from Jim Warren. And I did understand. I didn't like it, but I stepped aside. And anybody who knows anything about Jim Warren, he's not always the easiest guy to get along with. And eventually, after 16 issues, he and Will parted ways. And Will called me and he said, do you think there's any life left in this property? And I said, I do. So at that point, I picked up the magazine after number 16, and from number 17 until I think 41, Kitchen Sink published it. And at the same time, there was a series of Spirit comic books and Will Eisner's Quarterly, and then, of course, the graphic novels. So that was a key moment, the early 70s, when Will, I think, didn't quite believe that the new comic book market would support something he created, quite a few years earlier. In large part, it was timing, because, as you know, a lot of your listeners know, the specialty market was just developing then. Initially, I used the head shop market for undergrounds, but starting, just roughly in early 70s, these independent comic shops started popping up all over, and distributors to support them. And once Phil Suling convinced Marvel and DC that they should bypass the newsstand distributors and go to what we call the direct market, that changed everything, and it kind of democratized the industry, and it put more power into the hands of the retailers and the small publishers and the creators in a way that hadn't been the case earlier.
Now, you were mentioning earlier that when Will Eisner approached you and started asking you questions about the publishing practices and whatnot, the economics behind what you were doing, how did it feel? Maybe not so much for you, but for those that you worked with, right? Others in the underground, when they saw this guy smoking a pipe, I guess the quote unquote regular kind, wearing a suit and tie and having an interest in this. I mean, how did that go down in the underground community from people you were associated with?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, you can't say there was a universal response one way or the other, but I can tell you that among my creative colleagues, the other cartoonists, he was someone that was widely admired. He and Harvey Kurtzman were two really crucial figures for us in terms of setting the pace, the kind of innovative work that they had done in the 40s and 50s, and in Harvey's case later. Those were inspirational to us. So I was never someone who bought into Abby Hoffman's, bromide of not to trust anyone over 30. That was ridiculous. I loved comics, and I certainly was focused on publishing comics by my peers, and I was excited by that, and I was caught up in that particular generational movement. But that didn't mean that I didn't also have an interest in the work of those who came before. That was important. And to me, that work needed to be back in print, needed to be available the same way I would have wanted to see a Citizen Kane or, any other classic black and white movie or silent movie. You can't dismiss history just because we were caught up in the whole counterculture. It wasn't a vacuum. And I took the chance. It was my company. It was my meager capital that I decided to gamble, and it paid off. There were always what I would call, ironically, more conservative hippies who, didn't want anything except the contemporary work. And I don't think anybody was lighting up a joint and reading the Spirit in their pad. But nonetheless, what we as a young generation were looking for was just hard to sum up. But in the field of comics, we wanted good comics. And Robert Crumb and Gilbert Shelton and Kim Deitch and the other few dozen guys who were out there creating couldn't do enough to satisfy. And to me, the classic stuff by Eisner and Kurtzman and others needed to get back into print. And so I started that in 1971. By the mid-'70s, the hippie movement was dying out, and people were cutting their hair and getting jobs, and the Vietnam War was ending, and a lot of those issues might still have been smoldering and burning, but that particular movement, unified by things like head shops, which themselves were being pushed out of business by localities that didn't want their kids going in and buying bongs and things. All of this was tied together. So as it transformed into this direct market where you had specialty comic shops, you went in to buy comics and not bongs and psychedelic posters, I made that transition pretty easily, in part because I was interested in doing the classic comics. So it wasn't just the Spirit. Some of your older listeners may know I was also reprinting classic things like Flash Gordon and Little Abner and Alley-Oop and, you name it, even Nancy and Sluggo. I love the old stuff. And so in many ways, Will was the entree to that, and also in many ways a mentor to me. I didn't go to college to study business. I was a journalist in terms of my degree. So starting a company for me was something I created out of no training, no life experience. And I stumbled a few times. And Will, who had been there before, was a very helpful mentor. So it was a special relationship.
Now, all this makes sense, and, especially what you said, some of this classic stuff needed to be out there, right? So it makes sense that Kitchen Sink Press would put out, issues of the Spirit. But I'm curious, did you then feel that there was something about the character of the Spirit, the comic, the Spirit, that resonated with readers of underground comics in ways that other, for lack of a better word, maybe more mainstream-ish properties didn't?
That's hard to say. I'm not sure I consciously had that conversation with myself. You got to remember, I wasn't thinking in terms of what does the market want. It was honestly a little more probably self-centered in that I love this material. I think there's enough other people out there who will love it too. It was a gut instinct. It wasn't like I did a marketing survey. Couldn't have afforded it if I wanted to. I had to rely on my gut, and I had already known from the other comics I had published by the so-called underground guys that not all of them were going to be bestsellers. But if I really liked somebody's work, I'd put them in an anthology or I'd give them a chance, because to me that was part of my responsibility as any publisher. You want to discover authors, but at the same time, tried and true creators like Will Eisner, I thought, deserved that exposure too. And that's not to say everyone who bought a Furry Freak Brothers, bought a Spirit, but enough of them did. There was enough overlap that I believe the first issue sold 20,000 copies. And that was a decent seller. For me, not a bestseller, but anything I did back then sold a minimum of 10,000. And 10,000 was kind of the test. If a book wasn't reprinted back then it was kind of a failure. because the good ones we reprinted several times, sometimes many times. Somebody like Crumb, I think, the bestseller book I had by him, I reprinted 14 or 15 times. That was the nature of the market. We weren't producing monthlies like Marvel and DC. We were producing things that were more like a paperback book that would keep selling. You keep it on the rack. When it finally stopped selling, retailers would drop it. It's a different approach, one of many different approaches.
You had said a moment ago that you had a unique relationship with Eisner, and what started out as, I guess, a business relationship eventually evolved into something a little more friendly. And I'm curious, did you see Eisner at the time, as you got to know him, as, say, more of a colleague within publishing or more of a father-type figure when it comes to the economics of comics?
Yeah, it did evolve to a point where I did see him as a fatherly figure. My own father died when I was 13 years old, and I think on some subconscious level, given the age difference and the way he was always helpful and how welcome I was into he and Ann's home, without those words being said, yeah, I think it was kind of a mutual feeling. But I don't think I was lucky to be in that position, because I was lucky that our relationship started so early. But I witnessed Will being kind and fatherly to many other people in the industry. They just didn't have the luxury of spending as much time as I did, and I'm selfishly grateful for that. But Will was a kind man who was always doing his best to help young artists, to help nurture talent, and to see the industry grow. The Will Eisner Awards came out of his, he didn't invent them, but when he was approached, he agreed to do it because he thought the industry needed to reward excellence and to encourage the growth of other innovators. And in fact, he's the one who insisted that retailers have a category, because he wanted to make sure that really good retail operations would also get recognition. And he wanted to encourage a diversity of title. He knew that companies like Marvel and DC would be dominant and would potentially drive out small players. And so he wanted to make sure that independents had their share of rack space in stores. And that was one of the criteria for winning an Eisner Award. If you only sold Marvel and DC comics, you wouldn't even be qualified. So in many, many ways, he did his best to change the industry and make it better. And I was glad to watch that evolve over the years.
Well, by the time that you met him, let me put it this way. After you met him is when he was really formulating what eventually became A Contract with God, and that was originally published in 1978. And I'm wondering, you getting closer to him, as a colleague and then as a friend and as a, kind of a mentor-mentee relationship, what did you know about his work on what would become A Contract with God? What did he share with you? What kind of insights did you have?
Well, it's funny. I just wrote an essay about that. There's a deluxe 2-volume set of Contract with God coming out in a few months. 1 volume pencils, 1 volume inks from the original art. And in there, I actually addressed that. And the truth is, Will shared very little. When he was working on a project, he played cards very close to his vest. He had a feeling that if he told a publisher or a colleague too much about a project, it would somehow spoil it, or their input would destroy his singular vision. And so he worked very privately on it. What I knew was the vaguest, that it had some slight or subliminal autobiographical elements, and that it took place in New York in the Great Depression. So it wasn't until it was finally out that I was able to see it. It's not one I got a sneak preview of. In later years, I did have that privilege. But with Contract with God, as soon as I knew he was working on something special, as ill-defined as it was, I said to him, I hope I'll be able to publish that. And for the first time, he actually said, "No, Dennis, I'm sorry." At that time, I was in central Wisconsin, and I had the prestigious address of number 2 Swamp Road in a little town called Princeton, in the middle of farmland. And Will said, "For this book, Dennis," he said, "I really need someone in New York with a Park Avenue address." And I understood. He wanted to find a mainstream audience, and he didn't think I could do that. And so I understood in the same way he went to Warren temporarily because I couldn't provide that service at that point in time. And it turned out no major publisher would touch it either because they didn't know what it was. To them, it was still kind of a comic book. They couldn't even imagine putting out a book like that. So he ended up doing it with a small company called Baronet. And when Baronet went out of business, then I inherited it again. So I did publish Contract with God, but not initially. And I understood his reasoning. But it was just wonderful to see him devote his energy to something like that, because when it came onto the scene, it just had an amazing impact, certainly among professionals. It was inspirational. You have to imagine a world in which there were comic books, but not books with square spines that contained comics. That was unknown. There had been a couple, 3 precedents, maybe Jungle Book. There was one, It Rhymes with Lust.
Right.
And arguably 1 or 2 others. But none of those were successful in any commercial sense. I mean, when Jungle Book came out, I remember being a teenager and going, "Wow, I love this. It's amazing." But there was never anything else like it because it sold poorly, and Ballantine Books wasn't going to give Harvey a chance to do another. They wanted him because his Mad paperbacks had sold millions and millions. Jungle Book was not Mad, for better or worse. I mean, in my view, the world would be a better place if Harvey had done more books like Jungle Book. But the market couldn't sustain it. But by the time Will came along with Contract with God, even though it wasn't technically the first graphic novel, depending on how you define it, what it was the first one that had success, that had impact. And at that time, as we were discussing earlier, there was, by this time, a network of specialty shops. There were, somewhere 2,000, 3,000 retailers in North America who would be happy to carry a book like that as opposed to the prior business model. And so even though Contract with God wasn't a bestseller by that definition, it had the impact no other book did. And people like Frank Miller to this day will still wax rhapsodic about the effect it had on him. And Frank wasn't the only one. So if you look at the timeline, shortly after Contract with God, you see more and more what we now call graphic novels appear. And now, you walk into a Barnes & Noble or you go anywhere, you see this is now a standard genre. I mean, libraries now have rows of them, and they're among the fastest books circulating in libraries. I was just at one yesterday, and the librarian was telling me how it's been the fastest expanding section in Amherst, Massachusetts, anyway, and I think that's typical. So what Will kicked off, I don't think he ever, as optimistic as he was, didn't necessarily think he was starting a revolution, but it was a revolutionary moment in our industry.
Well, what do you remember about your reaction at the time when you first saw a published Contract with God? You mentioned you really didn't know much of anything about it, that Eisner had kind of kept a lot of it from you and others. So when you saw it, do you remember what your reaction was?
I remember rereading it several times and savoring it. I loved the art. I loved the fact that it wasn't a standard format. I was expecting kind of, a larger comic book, but it wasn't like comic book size. It was smaller. He sometimes would have a single panel on a page, and typically just 2 or 3. The transition between the panels was more seamless, the way he came to be famous for in subsequent graphic novels. His storytelling technique was just breaking all the conventions. I even love the fact that it wasn't color, nor was it black and white. It was a sepia ink on kind of a yellowish paper, as I recall. And so everything about it was different. And I love the fact that I put it on my shelf and it had a spine. It wasn't a comic book. And psychologically, I can't tell you how important that is. For those of us in the industry then, for many years, comic books were looked down upon as kind of the lowest of the low. If you talked about literature, I mean, they wouldn't qualify to be called, quote, literature. And suddenly we had one of the leading practitioners in this field who made something that looked like a book, it read like a book, it had literary pretensions, and it was something to be proud of. It was something to be able to put in somebody's face when they dismiss comics. And you could say, oh yeah, well look at this. And the fact that it quickly spawned all kinds of other professionals to begin to widen their aspirations, it's just a remarkable time. And if you think pre-1978, we were really stuck in the groove of that stapled pamphlet that we loved. I mean, I love comic books to this day, and I'm not dismissing them, but we were stuck in that groove. And this allowed the culture to see a different kind of comic book, and it wasn't for kids. It was something an artist could do for his peers and not for, that 14-year-old kid in Kansas City. And so, again, for younger listeners who can't quite imagine that, you have to put it all in that context.
I've always found it interesting that, a lot of people have, I guess, historically speaking, mistakenly thought of Contract with God as the first graphic novel. It's definitely the graphic novel that I guess has done the most to popularize the term graphic novel. But the curious thing about that, it's not really a novel. It's a collection of 4 stories. And so it's more of a story cycle than a novel. But as he went on as a graphic novelist, if we want to call Eisner that, he did write more in the long form style, The Heart of the Storm, Dropsy Avenue, Name of the Game. And I was curious, you were there, you knew him, you were friends with him, and so you had a ground level view of what he was doing in expanding his art in terms of these longer form kinds of narratives. And so what are your memories about his work on some of the later books after A Contract with God?
Sure. I think he was, to put it mildly, he was very gratified to see that Contract with God did break out and have some recognition. And even though it wasn't, like I said earlier, a bestseller, it was successful enough and stayed in print. It's been in print continually since 1978. Kitchen Sink did it after Baronet, and then after Kitchen Sink ended in 99, DC Comics did it, and then I think around 2004 or so, Norton, W.W. Norton published it, and they have since. And it's also in, I've stopped counting now, something like 28 or 30 languages around the world, and they still keep selling new languages. I was just notified there's going to be a Russian publisher and a Chinese publisher. So it's had worldwide impact gradually over the years, not just in the States or in Europe. But as Will was fortified by that and had retired himself from his other businesses, he was still a relatively young man. I think he was in his mid-60s when Contract with God came out. And so he was still full of energy, and he had no distractions. He could make this a full-time thing. And because he had successful businesses when he retired and sold them, he didn't rely on an advance from a publisher to do a book like most authors and cartoonists are, kind of forced to. So he had the luxury of doing whatever he wanted. And so when he had an idea for a book, he would dedicate himself to it, and it would take him typically 8 months to a year to do a book. And so during a time when his colleagues were steadily retiring and stopped working, Will produced another 20 or so graphic novels. And in addition to that, his textbooks and smaller works. And for him, it was, I think, constantly exhilarating to be able to do that. And I think many times he wished he had been able to start earlier, but the market wouldn't have been receptive earlier for reasons we touched on earlier. And after Contract with God, I did have the luxury of hearing the general idea and starting to see my editor, Dave Schreiner, and I would get the pencil roughs, and he would ask for feedback, but to a limited degree. Once he was set in a project, he was going to take it to its end, but he wanted to make sure if we caught any plot holes or anything that was significant that we could nip in the bud. And of course, the obvious things like grammatical or spelling things. Will wasn't the world's best speller or grammarian, but those things came later. And so Dave and I did our best to give him feedback. And early on, we kind of pulled our punches. And I remember the first time I experienced this, I think it was The Dreamer, where we were so respectful of Will that we didn't really want to say, hey, we don't like this. But when he sensed that we were pulling our punches, he said, look, your value to me, guys, is to be completely honest. And he said, I insist that you be critical where necessary. He said, I'm a grown man, I can take it. And once he gave us that freedom, and we could occasionally be even brutal in the criticism, but that's what he wanted. And I remember The Dreamer in particular started out was, I think only, might have been a 16-page, very short thing. And I remember thinking, God, Will, I want to know more about the birth of the comics industry. You've got to fatten this up. And so he made it a little longer and a little longer. He got up to 56 pages, and to me and to Dave, it still was too skeletal. And he finally just said, stop. He said, this is the book I'm doing. So he did a 56-page Dreamer. I would have preferred a 156-page Dreamer with some of these characters fleshed out more. And I remember when he touched on Donenfeld and Leibowitz, the publishers at DC, and I remember saying to him, Will, you kind of treat them with kid gloves here. Those guys are really scoundrels. And he said, well, probably they were, but he said, I didn't know firsthand. And I said, but who's still around who knows secondhand? I mean, you really ought to be a little tougher on these characters. And he said, at that time, Leibowitz was still alive, and Donenfeld's son was involved in D.C., and he was too much of a gentleman. He didn't want to do that kind of a tell-all book. So he told the book he did, and it was kind of a compromise. We got a fatter book than we originally would have seen, and he told the story he wanted to tell. But I often wish, even later on, he had gone back and expanded that, because all of us who love comics are curious about the origins of that industry, and including what we know was a very unsavory side to a lot of the characters and practices. But he didn't want to tell a story like that. So there was give and take, but in the case of most of the books, Will told the story he wanted to tell without and really allowing anyone to substantially change the story he wanted to tell.
It's interesting to hear your comments on The Dreamer in the early stages, especially because I remember the very first time that I read The Dreamer, I thought that it could have been longer, and my gut feeling at the time was that this is something that's on the precipice of being a really good long-form story, but I wanted more. And so, I mean, it's for that reason. I know a lot of people reference The Dreamer whenever they're talking about Will Eisner as a graphic novelist, and I think primarily because of the autobiographical elements. I don't know, it just hasn't resonated with me as much as it has with, I guess, some others. And definitely not like To the Heart of the Storm, which I think is one of his best long-form stories. And that definitely has that autobiographical feel to it. It's much more overt than in some of the other things. I mean, he was trying not only to pull some of his punches when it came to the industry with The Dreamer, but also he was, I guess to some degree, kind of pulling himself out of the narrative, or at least that, overt autobiographical line, even though we know that this is based on his experiences. But with To the Heart of the Storm, he just lets it go.
Right. I agree with you, and I'm actually kind of, in a weird way, glad you agree on The Dreamer, because sometimes I feel guilty criticizing it. But yeah, I think Heart of the Storm was a wonderful one, and I think Life Force is my other favorite. Mm-hmm. But not every one of his books was a masterpiece, and I think Will also liked to, sometimes after he would do a heavy book like those two, he would intersperse it with something lighter. Like any author, he followed his own muse, and sometimes as a publisher, I could have tried to push him in other directions, but that wouldn't have worked anyway. And sometimes he would veer off. Early on, he was doing still things for scholastic books for younger readers with one or two of his students, and he even did one time. He did a book no one knows. Will did a bartender guide, and the only way you would know it was his was if you looked in the Indicia page in the really tiny type that was barely readable, and it would say "Copyright Poorhouse Press," which was his corporate name. And what he did with that was he just took basically standard bartender recipes, but what he added visually was the type of glass you would use, because they're, what do you serve in a cocktail versus a gin Ricky or whatever. He would tell you the kind of glass. And it was such a basic little thing, and I remember thinking, well, all right, that's a clever idea, Will, but why would you waste your time on that when you could be doing more comics? And he told me a story I'll never forget. He said when he was young, and as his father was an aspiring artist who never really made a living as an artist, but he was artistic. And Will's mother was very practical because they had a tough time of it, especially during the Great Depression, and had suffered a lot of privation. So early on, when Will showed artistic talent and wanted to go in that direction, his father encouraged him, and his mother did not. She said, "Do not be like your father, who has a tough time, bringing food to the table. You make money. That's what you should do." And so he picked up that bartender guide, and he waved it at me, and he said, "When I do Contract with God, my father is happy." He pointed up in the sky, and then he took the bartender book, and he said, "This one makes my mother happy." Because that book sold far more than probably his graphic novels combined, and no one even knew about it.
Another thing that is noticeable about Eisner's later career, from the 70s, Contract with God on, is that, I mentioned one thing was you saw more longer form narratives from him, but at the same time, you also see not only more stories that are overtly autobiographical in nature, but also there's more of an emphasis on his Jewishness, his Jewish roots, his background, his ethnic background. That's there definitely in A Contract with God, right? Of the four stories, there are two that are, if not about Jewishness, they're centered in a Jewish milieu that, says everything about how he grew up, his background and whatnot. I mean, you can definitely see that in there.
Absolutely. Yep.
But when we get into some of these later graphic novels, again, like To the Heart of the Storm, but there are others as well. There's Fagin the Jew. He's dealing with issues of ethnicity or Jewishness in a much more direct way. And then we get to the very last book that came out while he was alive, The Plot. And so I remember when I read that, I thought, wow, this is on the one hand, I thought that it was the culmination of where he was going in terms of writing about Jewishness in one form or another over his career. At the same time, it just struck me as quite different. I mean, strikingly different from almost everything else that I had been reading of his. And what were your impressions of the plot as he was working on it and then when it came out?
Yeah, and technically, I think you mentioned it came out while he was alive. Technically, that one was published posthumously.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, he had finished it. It had gone to press shortly before he died.
But he had finished it, yeah.
Yes, yes. And that one was certainly, of all of his work, the most, I guess you'd say, didactic in the sense of it was a nonfiction. He was genuinely upset to learn that the Protocols of the Elders of Zion was still being read, circulated, and believed in the 21st century. And he was so appalled that he just felt he needed to use comics, the medium he knew best, to try to educate younger readers who probably didn't know the history of it. And so he put himself in it to the extent it's autobiographical. He has himself doing the research on the book. But the vast majority of it is historical flashbacks to its actual origins and how it was exposed as a fake by British journalists and so on. And so he was very pleased, I think, to be able to do something late in life that he felt was educational in more of a political and historical sense. And one of the things he did when we were negotiating that contract, was the last contract Will was involved with, was he insisted with the publisher, W.W. Norton, that they have world rights to translate it, but that they could not charge a fee for any Arabic languages or in any languages in any Muslim-dominated countries, that the publisher was required to give those rights free to any publisher who would do them. And because it was his goal that as much as possible, his book be read by young Egyptians and young Yemenis and Pakistanis who were most likely to also see the protocols in their language. And I'm sad to say, while we had discussions, no publisher in any of those countries has yet been brave enough or willing to do that. We've even had offers of help from the United Nations, for example, and introductions, but no one has yet done that. But that was his goal, was to not just have English-speaking audiences read it for what it is, but to have an impact where it was most needed. And I think that was the kind of thing probably he would have continued doing had he lived longer, because though Will was almost 88 years old when he did that and when he died, his skills were as good as ever. You look at the plot, you don't see a diminution of his drawing skills or his writing skills. And so I think that's a direction he probably would have taken more so than fiction. I think he was, in some ways, he had already told every aspect of his own family story. He even used his wife's family story when he did The Name of the Game. Mm-hmm. That's a thinly disguised version of Ann Eisner's family, which he ironically inserted himself in. If any of your readers haven't read Family Matter at all or haven't reread it lately, I recommend you go back and reread it and imagine and know that the poet in that story is Will in a fictional way, because when Anne married Anne in around 1950, Anne's father was a stockbroker who invited Will into his firm. And Will at that point was technically still doing the Spirit, but he was doing other things, and he was successful. And he said, "Thank you, Mr. Weingarten, but I think I'll continue in the field I know best." So when he finally did the story of Anne's family, he took that moment in time when he was offered that opportunity to leave the field of art and comics and to become a stockbroker. And in the plot, he has the character who is Anne marry a poet. The poet is Will. The twist is that the poet turns out to be a real son of a bitch in the rest of the story. And I think that's Will saying to himself, I might have been a different person had I gone that direction, and I might have become greedy, and I might have lost my values, and so on. It's a speculation. It's a what might have been. And I find that kind of endlessly amusing to see Will play that kind of fictional game, even though the book itself is largely biographical. So I think he had run out of stories like that. He had exhausted all of the personal, the family, friends of his stories, and I think the more didactic material appealed to him as he approached 90. The last time I visited him in November 2004, about 6 weeks before he died, he told me he was contemplating doing the Quran. And I remember even then, this is, I don't remember my exact words, but basically it was, well, that would be a very dangerous thing to do. And he said, I'm an old man, what are they going to do to me? He, I think, was just fascinated by the possibility of exploring that. Now, whether he would have actually done it or not, I don't know, but he was certainly toying with the idea, and that would have not exactly been a Jewish book, but it would have been historical, and it would have been a challenge, and he was always up for a challenge.
And years before Charlie Hebdo.
Yep.
Yeah. So that was a direction very late in his life that he was contemplating in going with his work, in the more educational, didactic end of things.
I think so. I mean, we didn't have enough of a time period to really see how far he'd take it, but I think the plot was an important statement for him. I think he wanted to have some kind of an impact on the political side of life and not just the literature side.
Now, you mentioned a while ago this new work that you're coming out with along, kitchen sink books along with Dark Horse, and that is this new edition, this 2-volume Contract with God. And that's called the Contract with God Curators Edition, correct?
Correct. Yep.
Okay. So tell me more about that. I know I read about it when it was first solicited, but I don't know exactly what all goes into this.
Sure. Well, I'll give you a few teasers, and then hopefully, if you can afford it, you and some of your readers will buy it. It's not cheap, but I can tell you it'll be a beautiful box set and something to be proud of. It came about in part because of the trend in recent years for what IDW started with the Artist Edition, the idea of taking the original art and showing it the same size so you are virtually holding the original in your hands, warts and all. And one of the interesting things about Contract with God is that Will tightly penciled it, but then instead of inking his pencils, he put a sheet of vellum over it. Vellum, for those who don't know, is a semi-translucent paper with a nice tooth to it, so you can ink on it, but it's then separate from the pencil. So he's, in essence, when you're inking, you're basically tracing your own pencils only with ink. In this case, he put a layer between them. So what happened was the two survived. And as the art agent for the family, one of the things I had been told early on was, you can start gradually selling Will's art, but not Contract with God. That was the one that was most sentimental to Anne. And so as a result, for all these many years, the original inks and pencils were untouched. And in the course of preparing for this book, I pulled out the pencils that hadn't been looked at in a long time, and Will used to use rubber cement a lot, and anyone who's ever used rubber cement knows it's not permanent, it's not archival. And after not too many years, it dries out, and the piece of paper that was glued will literally fall off what it was originally attached to. And when I started looking at the first title story, where the young Frimi Hirsch is a young boy in Russia, and he's decided to make his contract with God. You see him sitting, writing on a tablet, and you never see the document itself. Well, to my astonishment, when I touched that page, the paste-up fell off, and underneath it, I couldn't help laughing, was Will had actually written the contract itself. So the legal language was on a tablet. And I laughed because it was Will the businessman who liked writing contracts, that was his first impulse. And then, without an editor looking over his shoulder or anyone else, I think he decided sometime afterward, well, this probably is going to be a distraction to the reader, and every lawyer or, quasi-lawyer or anybody is going to start arguing with this language. And so he covered it up, and he just showed the boy writing it and not the words themselves. So that was, to me, a great revelation of... I loosely call comics archaeology, where you're literally getting under the surface. And then I discovered there was another, discovered's the wrong word, I had seen it years earlier, but it suddenly I realized there was a page also in the Super, the one with the superintendent in the bowels of the Dropsy Avenue tenement who is taken advantage of, ironically enough, by a girl who's about 11 years old. And in that case, it wasn't a paste-up, but there was a fully, tightly penciled page that Will chose not to ink. And basically it showed this Super when he was still in Germany, and he was a brown shirt, and he had issues with his mother and his father, and Will kept the pencil, but he never inked it. And again, I think he thought about it, and he decided, well, this is already an unsympathetic character, so I don't really need to infer that he's a Nazi or has issues with his mother. The story works without that. Mm-hmm. And so with those examples in mind, they inspired a short essay I wrote, which is basically just some of the what-ifs. And what this book shows, for anyone who's ever read and enjoyed Contract with God, it shows it in progress, in a way that you can see what Will's very first thoughts were, and then how he literally changed aspects of it, withheld aspects of it, and even in cases where he did ink over the pencil, he sometimes would change the art still. He would change words in the balloons. And so, and there were a few other episodes, too, where I think there's a section of 6 or 8 pages where the family's on the way to the resort in the Cook Line story that he just omits entirely because he thought it was kind of dead weight. But for those of us who love Contract with God and understand its importance, it's great to go back and see this. It's like, to me, it's like you finding an old, a Hemingway transcript where you see the words he originally typed and then crossed out, and it's the peek behind the curtains you don't often get with a great work. And so I think that alone is worth the price of admission, but then you also get to see the art more perfectly reproduced than you've ever seen it before, because you see the actual art with every little tiny mark and erasure and whiteout and note on the side and coffee stain.
So much of it is, as you pointed out, reminiscent of, let's say, the IDW artist editions and other publishers that are doing something similar now. But there are also other parts of this. You mentioned that you have an essay. Are there other contributions to this Curators Edition? Yes.
We, John Lind, who put this together with me, reached out to past winners of Eisner Awards. And so there are 8 or 10 multiple Eisner Award winners who contributed short paragraphs, typically, about what impact Contract with God had on them. So we tried to tie together the artists who were younger than Will, who won the award named after him, but were still impacted by that particular work. So those are interspersed throughout. And then there's a couple of other essays, but the work basically speaks for itself.
Now, one thing I'm curious about, if you have any insights into this, in your relationship with Will Eisner and your work on this Curators Edition, do you know if Eisner had always intended the order of those 4 stories in A Contract with God to be in that exact order? In other words, did he contemplate mixing things up a bit? I mean, obviously, the title story would have to come first, but would maybe Küchelein be second or third? Did he?
No, I think he definitely picked those, and it's clear from the pencils and the pagination that that's the order he wanted them in. And I think in part it's because the very last story ends. It's the autobiographical story where Will is literally on the fire escape of their tenement in, I guess, the Bronx, where he's contemplating his own future. So I think he ends it on that note of him as a young man thinking about what lies before him, as he's in fact an older man doing what might be, the most famous thing he's ever done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's good to hear that, because I've made the argument in some of my scholarship that there is a purpose behind the ordering of the story, and not just on a kind of macro story level, but on a much more micro level of the way that he interweaves images and how those are significant among and throughout all 4 stories.
Well, interesting. Then your theory is vindicated.
Yes, that's what I say. I'm glad to hear that. And you mentioned that last page of Contract with God in the Küchelein story. It's one of the things that amazed me when Norton got the Will Eisner graphic novel library and started to reprint a lot of that stuff. And some of the books included new art, Contract with God being one of them. I know Dropsy Avenue was another one. And I think with those additional pieces, which I think came at the very end, I think that it really added something that the original texts, not that necessarily they were missing, but it kind of underscored, or put, if you want to think of it this way, an exclamation mark at the end. So, for instance, that, I guess, added image in A Contract with God is a visual from behind the title or the character of Will in Küchelein. And so you don't see him front on. You see him from behind as he's looking out into kind of an open space, contemplating what next. And that just had, for me at least, a much different impact than the original ending in the last visuals we saw in Contract with God.
Okay. Well, I'm glad to hear you. You like the way he structured it, and he'd be happy to hear that too.
Yes. Now, what do you know about Norton acquiring Eisner's properties, the graphic novels, back in the 2000s?
Well, that was Will was alive when we did that. Judy Hansen and I were his agents, and Will had gotten to the point where the decision we made to bring his work to D.C. after Kitchen Sink went under was, at the time, a decision that made sense. But after about 4 or 5 years, Will said one day, he said, I think it's fitting that the spirit be with D.C. as a masked hero, but he said, I would like my other work to be with a literary house. He said, I want you to find a publisher that doesn't have comics in the title. Those were his instructions. And so at that time, Norton was selected in large part because it was the last, and still is, the last large independent publisher. Every other publisher in America is pretty much owned by a conglomerate. Like 3 companies own everything, and that includes publishers. But Norton is still independent, but they're still sizable. They still have heft. They have a strong literary tradition. And one of the things Will and I liked about it was they have even an employee stock ownership plan. So the people who are there, the editors and the people we deal with, they literally own a piece of the company. and so they had less turnover. They're likely to be loyal to the company that treated them well. So for various reasons, we went there, and Bob Weil was the original editor, and then Tom Meyer, and both of them had a chance to interact with Will directly, and I think it was, in retrospect, a very smart move. They also have a very strong international rights department, which is why, as I mentioned earlier, Contract with God in particular is in, again, I want to say somewhere in the high 20s, maybe 30 different languages. And Will's other books, too, to varying degrees, have been translated worldwide. So that was part of, Will early on used the phrase literary pretensions to me in the context of talking with his colleagues back in the National Cartoonist Society in the 1940s. And he said they looked at him funny because he had, quote, literary pretensions. When people like Rube Goldberg would say to him, "Hey, we're just here to sell newspapers, kid," they didn't think the way he did. As brilliant as many of them were, they didn't see the medium and the potential of it as a literary form. And so I think it finally, in his lifetime, came full circle, so that he started out with these really crummy 2-bit comic book publishers, that were, I think, unsavory. And he ended up with one of America's most prestigious publishing houses. Mm-hmm. And I like that symmetry.
You mentioned a moment ago representing him. And for those who don't know, Denis Kitchen Art Agency does represent the Eisner estate. And if people visit your website, DenisKitchen.com, they can see some of the original art that you have, not only for Eisner, but for others as well, because you also have, you work with the Harvey Kurtzman estate.
That's right. Yeah. Well, thanks for the plug, Derek.
Hey, sure.
If you ever wanted to consider owning an original Will Eisner, yes, the family is now authorized, in fact, even including Contract with God art to be sold.
So you have this new curated edition of Eisner's Contract with God that's going to be coming out in a couple or 3 months. What other stuff does Kitchen Sink Books have, maybe alongside Dark Horse, in the coming year or two? What can we expect? Maybe more from, if not Eisner, Kurtzman Library?
Yeah, I'll give you a couple of teasers, but they don't like it when things are revealed prematurely because they want their PR staff to make the announcement. But I can tell you that we're working on a Harvey Kurtzman project that will be out probably roughly a year. I can't tell you at the moment what it is, but it'll be another one in that curator collection tradition, shot from the original art, and it'll be material that's been largely unseen before. We're working on a project with Mark Schultz, and beyond that, I probably shouldn't say anything. But we try to focus on 1 or 2 projects a year that are exciting to us. We're not looking to create bestsellers, but it's things John Linda and I personally love and want to do and package in a very respectful way that we and the people we're working with will feel good about. So, at this point, I'm juggling a lot of things. I don't have time to be a full-time publisher, but having this imprint allows me to work with John to do the periodic project that's exciting. And so it's a balance I'm enjoying.
Yeah, and I should also mention that book that you worked on with, you mentioned John Lynn, that came out last year, Will Eisner, The Centennial Celebration, 1917 through 2017. People can still get, so they can check that out. And in fact, that's one of the things we discussed the last time you were on the podcast.
Probably, yep.
Yes. So, Denis, I very much appreciate you coming and talking with me for Will Eisner Week 2018. And do you have any other events for Will Eisner Week this year?
I just gave a talk yesterday at the Amherst Library, but all of us who are involved in Will Eisner Week, and there's quite a few that are spread out all over the country and occasionally outside the country, enjoy taking advantage of this week as an outreach program. Most typically it's with libraries, universities, and we all do our part to get the word out there. And while it's named after Will and it's a convenient excuse to use his birthday, it's really to promote the graphic novel in general as a medium, and it's to encourage new readers. And so posters are sent out to libraries and retailers and so on, and it's just a way to try to reinvigorate once a year a thought that really is year-round, but it needs a periodic shot in the arm.
Well, I'm glad you were here to help administer that shot. Denis, thanks a lot, and I look forward to talking with you again in the near future.
Thank you, Derek. It was a pleasure. Bye-bye.
I want to thank Denis Kitchen once again for coming back on the Comics Alternative to talk with me for Will Eisner Week. It was a fun conversation, and I have to say, Denis has me regretting the fact that I didn't pre-order a copy of A Contract with God, the Curators Collection. Who knows? I just might have to break down and get this 2-volume set when it comes out later this year. The way that Denis described it, it's a must-have for every serious Will Eisner scholar, or for anyone interested in comics history for that matter. And if you want to find great discounts on works by and about Will Eisner, then you should definitely check out the website of our sponsor, Discount Comic Book Service. As I mentioned at the top of the show, if you go to dcbservice.com right now, you'll find several Eisner-related works, including Denis Kitchen's own Will Eisner, The Centennial Celebration, 1917 through 2017, at great prices. That's dcbservice.com. And after you do get your comics there, get in touch with me and let me know about your thoughts on Will Eisner Week. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way by picking up your phone and dialing 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427. You can also email us. We are 2guys@comicsalternative.com, or you can contact me directly at derek@comicsalternative.com. And you can find us all over social media. We have accounts on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, Slack, Discord, and YouTube. You can subscribe to the podcast through Apple Podcast. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on Spotify, on TuneIn, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, comicsalternative.com. We'll be back with more episodes and more interviews in the coming weeks, so check back for those. Until then, take care.